The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents The Bible, Part 1, The Sermon on the Mount. So over the many years that I've been doing the TV show and the debates, a lot of people will look at me because I'll frequently reference the Bible or something the Bible has to say, and they'll view me as an expert on the Bible. The truth is, I'm not an expert. Very, very few people are. I mean, you can study it for most of your life and not necessarily be an expert because there are so many facets to the Bible and to other holy books. There's the idea of which translation do you read? How accurate is your translation? It was written in languages that have changed and modified and died out. How accurate is your translation? How do you go about interpreting it? What's the context in which to view some of these stories? One of the reasons that people think I'm a Bible expert is because I know more than they do. I know more than most Christians do. Because most people, even when they believe, even when they want to point to the Bible and say, yes, this is the reason I believe, quite often they haven't read it, or haven't read all of it, or they haven't studied it. They've taken out the bits and pieces that are important to them, the things that they've heard in sermons, and they run with it. But when you're in conversation with them and they begin to point to the Bible to say, hey, this is the authority, this is the inspired Word of God, and they'll offer quotes. Sometimes some people will try to prove things in the Bible wrong or have conversations that are way beyond their level of expertise with the source material. The truth is, you don't have to know anything about the Bible at all to have a good conversation with someone who trusts the Bible, because you're allowed to ask questions. You're not the one selling something. You are currently unconvinced that this book is divine in origin, that it is inspired by a God. You see no reason to think that it's instructive or authoritative, or wonder, why should I even pay any attention to it in the first place? And so there are questions you can ask. One of the things I'm going to start doing on the Atheist Debates Project, beginning right now, is sort of an atheist Bible study. Now, this isn't just a Bible study for atheists. By all means, believers can look at it too, try to figure out where I might have gone wrong, take a look at what their personal interpretations are. But the goal is to give people at least a basic understanding of some things, some concerns that I have with different passages, so that they might actually have a conversation. Does this make sense? One of the things that I've seen over and over again is, even from prominent, outspoken atheists, is to point out that, yes, the Bible contains a lot of bad things, but that Jesus guy, he's all right. It's like they listened to the Doobie Brothers, Jesus is just all right with me, and ran with it from there. And so I've decided that we're going to begin with the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7 is generally considered by Christians to be the summation of Jesus' character, his mission, his message. It's viewed as the wisest thing anybody has ever said. When they read it, they are convinced that no mere mortal could have uttered these words. They must, in fact, be divine in origin. It's as much of a confirmation of his divine nature as pretty much anything you're going to find in the Bible. And there are atheists who look at it and say, yeah, Jesus said a lot of wonderful things, and the Sermon on the Mount is great. It's a good tale to read, and it has some good moral lessons. So that's why we're beginning with the Sermon on the Mount. Later on, we'll take a look at translations, interpretations, and various other problems to figure out, is this a book that anybody should be pointing to as the good book? Sermon on the Mount begins in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Now, I'm not just going to sit here on the side of a hill and read the entire Sermon on the Mount to you. Instead, let's pick out some highlights and lowlights and give people something to think about and discuss. For a full verse-by-verse deconstruction of this passage, you can visit wiki.ironchariots.org and do a search for Sermon on the Mount. The first handful of verses of the Sermon on the Mount, some of which you just heard, are known as the Beatitudes, but I think perhaps they're better described as the platitudes, because essentially Jesus is simply saying, hey, if you've had it bad, it gets better. And if it doesn't get better in this life, it'll get better in the next. The first 4 Beatitudes are found in both Matthew and Luke, with possibly the exception of verse 3, where Matthew says poor in spirit, while Luke simply says poor. Luke also includes 2 additional verses that are noticeably absent from Matthew. In Luke 6, verses 24 and 25, it says, "But woe unto you that are rich, for ye have received your consolation. Woe unto you that are full, for ye shall hunger. Woe unto you that laugh now, for ye shall mourn and weep." These verses put a different spin on the Beatitudes. When considered alongside other verses, they stress poverty as a virtue and wealth, and not simply the seeking of wealth, as a vice. Regardless of which version, if any, is correct, the first 4 Beatitudes address traits and conditions that are generally undesirable, or in the case of meekness, taken advantage of. The speaker, who we'll just call Jesus for expediency, is essentially saying, don't despair, no matter how bad this life is, the next one will be better. These statements may provide comfort to believers, but they are in fact simply assertions without justification. In addition to comfort for believers who feel oppressed by the outside world, these verses serve to pacify those, like women and slaves, who are oppressed from fellow believers. These verses set the tone for a common theme that runs throughout the sermon, a theme that betrays the very mundane nature of the speaker. Instead of offering useful advice on how best to live this life, the one life we're certain about, the speaker shrugs this life off as meaningless, focusing instead on the life to come. Even if we were to assume that an afterlife exists, there's still no reason not to live this life to the fullest as well. And any being which possessed the wisdom and compassion that would qualify as divine and benevolent should realize this. Instead of pithy dismissals of this life, we should expect deep insights into the human condition and guidance on how to improve our time here, in addition to promises of an afterlife. Continuing on, verses 7, 8, and 9 address the merciful, the pure in heart, and the peacemakers, essentially saying the merciful are going to get mercy, and the others are going to get to see God or be called children of God. This is a bit of a carrot towards correct behavior. Hey, you should probably be merciful so that you'll get mercy from God. You should be pure so you'll see God, and you should be a peacemaker so you'll be called a child of God. It's a naive way to develop a moral code, and we would expect something more significant from a divine and wise being. Verses 10, 11, and 12 begin a second theme for the sermon, and they're interesting because they serve as a foundation for claims of persecution from Christians. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. They establish an expectation of persecution. They may in fact encourage martyrdom. It's no surprise that we hear Christians claiming about how they're being persecuted for merely exercising their beliefs, when normally the perceived persecution is really an attempt to discourage theist Christians in particular from attempting to legislate their particular religious views onto others. This encouragement to expect and relish persecution or perception of persecution isn't good advice or wise counsel. It's bad advice. It encourages divisiveness by discouraging cooperation. There's no incentive for Christians to seek out cooperative social relationships with non-believers. They're expecting to be ostracized and persecuted, and any perceived persecution only serves to reinforce their beliefs. Anytime they think they've been persecuted, that means they're doing the right thing by God. Moving on, verses 14 through 16 talk about Christians as the light of the world, culminating in verse 16, which says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." We'll fast forward a bit to chapter 6, beginning at verse 1, where it says, "Take heed that you do not do your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven." When you compare this to Matthew 5:16,
He had told people to do their good works where they can be seen. And then in chapter 6, he's contradicting himself. And some apologists have claimed that this verse is about donating to charity and that the other verse is about other good deeds. And that seems to simply be about a wordplay to avoid an obvious contradiction. In any case, any being that might qualify as a god would surely have avoided any ambiguity that would lead to confusion, an observation that seems to apply to the bulk of the Bible and not simply to this sermon. In verses 17 through 20, Jesus talks about the law, beginning by saying that he hasn't come to destroy it, but to fulfill it, and that not a jot or tittle shall pass away until everything's been fulfilled. In verse 19, he says something interesting, though. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. It doesn't say that breaking the commandments sends you to hell. It just says you'll be among the least in heaven. Now, the common doctrine is that Jesus is talking to people who have already been saved, whose price for sins has already been paid. And this is where we might see the first inclination towards a once saved, always saved doctrine, that if you've been saved, you don't have to worry about breaking the commandments anymore because you've already been forgiven for it. But if you break the commandments and teach other people to do so, you're going to be considered least in heaven. Except that if you go to Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Jesus breaks a commandment and teaches others to do the same. He violates the Sabbath and then says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Now, apologists will point out that Jesus is God, and so he's above the law, and he makes the law, he can break it. But it doesn't settle the contradiction. This isn't just a clear do as I say, not as I do. It's, hey, I'm not changing the law. And anybody who tries to change the law and encourage people to do that is going to be the least in heaven. And then Jesus essentially changes the law on the Sabbath, changes the entire perception of the law on the Sabbath, and teaches people to break it, which represents a change in the law. So either there's a contradiction with regard to I'm not coming to change the law, or there's confusion about whether or not you should still obey the Sabbath. He violates a number of other commandments, pardoning an adulteress in John, declaring all food clean, violating kosher laws in Mark, and disrespecting his own mother in John. This may be another case of Jesus being above the law. But if you're above the law and you're encouraging behavior that is in conflict with the law, are you rewriting it? In which case, are you changing it? Or are you just a really bad example? So verses 21 through 26, Jesus talks about murder and lawsuits and a little bit about morality, beginning by saying, you've heard it said, don't kill, but anybody who's angry with his brother without reason is in danger of judgment. And whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. He's essentially establishing thought crimes and speech as equivalent to murder. And while it might be good advice to suggest that people speak civilly to each other, it's morally corrupt to establish that saying you hate someone is the equivalent to murdering them. Thoughts aren't crimes, actions are. While Jesus certainly didn't mean that we should put people to death for simply thinking about murder, his views here represent a naive morality that builds a doctrine where those thought crimes should result in eternal punishment. This is an echo of Old Testament morality, where the death penalty was prescribed for murder as well as working on the Sabbath or being an unruly child. It's expanded in the New Testament, where infinite punishment is prescribed for finite crimes, including thought crimes, specifically the thought crime of disbelief. We have here the beginnings of the foundations of sin as offense to God, that your thoughts are offensive to God in addition to your actions. And this is a powerful mechanism, and I would wholeheartedly agree that we should encourage people to have better thoughts because that's going to dictate your actions. But to equate thinking about someone in a negative light to murdering them in a metaphysical sense, with regard to eternal torment or eternal torture, is, I would say, immoral. Verses 23 and 24 have some sort of good advice. If you bring your gift to the altar, remember that your brother hath aught against thee. Leave the gift before the altar, go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Now, excluding that we're leaving gifts at an altar, it's good to suggest that people reconcile their differences. This would be an exceptionally good idea if we extended it to anyone instead of merely brother. As it stands, this instruction really only encourages believers to reconcile with other believers, and that's partially good advice. But surely we can expect a divine being who supposedly loves all of us to go the extra mile. This notion of believers reconciling with believers is a common theme in the New Testament that encourages an us versus them mentality that only adds to religious tensions. Verses 25 and 26, agree with thine adversary quickly whilst thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou shalt be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing. Confusing in the King James Version, but it's kind of a silly, pointless bit of advice in the modern world. Civil and criminal issues are different because our laws are more sophisticated than that of this ancient religion, and advising people to settle out of court essentially denies them the right to fight for their rights. It also encourages frivolous lawsuits, and if Christians actually adhered to this verse, they'd be getting sued left and right by any non-Christian. They would have been sued into extinction. Everyone knows this is bad advice, which is why nobody follows it. The only time this verse is referenced as binding is when one Christian wants to sue another and has a weak case. Verses 27 and 28 deal with adultery, where he says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say unto you, whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. This is not only more thought crime nonsense, it doesn't make sense. Lust isn't adultery. Lust is the trigger for the vast majority of sexual relationships, healthy, holy, or otherwise. You might take actions because of lust, and those actions might be crimes, but the lust itself isn't. It's doubtful that many Christian couples would have met, fell in love, and married without lust being a contributing factor. It may happen, but it's rarer than those who do lust after each other and build a healthy relationship. Additionally, this verse, like many, many others, is sexist, which would have been normal for the time, but there's no reason for God to be so chauvinistic. Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully, well, what about those who look at a man lustfully? What about getting outside of the gender binaries? I know that's revolutionary, but can women not lust? What about gays and lesbians? Oh, we talk about those in other passages, that they're just abominations. But this passage, like many others, simply focuses on everything from the man's perspective. When we get to divorce in verses 31 and 32, it says, whosoever put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. So it's more bad advice and more sexism. These verses only address men divorcing their wives. There's no instruction for wives because they are considered inferior subjects, nearly, if not actually, equal to property. This advice is bad even if it applied to both partners. Stay with your spouse unless they cheat on you. No matter how unhappy you are, no matter how much sadness or violence, you made your bed and you deserve to suffer for the rest of your life. That's what these verses are encouraging. What this tries to do is to force folks to work it out, but it's based on a naive view of reality that ignores the fact that people change, and some situations are simply not good marriages, even without infidelity. It shouldn't be considered the word of a wise God. It also encourages sexual infidelity. If you're miserable and want out, if you're abused and want out, and the only way out, according to your religion, is infidelity, then the best thing you could do is violate your marriage vows, go out and sleep with someone else, and now you can get a divorce. So in verse 33 through 37, we get to something that's actually good advice. In 33 through 36, Jesus is saying, hey, you've heard before about swearing oaths. I'm telling you, don't swear by this, don't swear by this, don't swear oaths at all. And in 37, he essentially says, let's communicate straightforward. Let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay. Yes, if it's a yes, no, if it's a no. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. And this is a good idea. Most of us would be happy to live in an honest life and feel no need to swear oaths to anything or on anything. There's no reason to think that oaths are evil, but speaking plainly and honestly seems to be good advice. Unfortunately, Christians don't tend to live up to this. They're happy to be sworn in on a Bible or a stack of them for civil service. They're happy to pledge allegiance to the flag and to the Christian flag and to the Bible, and they added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. They may be ignoring the words of Jesus and using Paul as an example, because it's recorded in Acts 18:18 that he swore an oath. And we can hardly fault Paul for this. It's not the only thing about Jesus' life and ministry that he doesn't seem to be aware of. But saying, hey, don't swear oaths, is something that seems to be ignored, except when it's convenient to point out that you shouldn't be swearing oaths. It's worth noting that some denominations, like Jehovah's Witnesses, actually take this advice. So shortly after saying he didn't come to change the law, he tries to change it yet again in verses 38 and 39, where he says, hey, I know you've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I'm telling you, don't resist evil, turn the other cheek. No, I'm all in favor of getting rid of the vengeful eye for an eye mentality. It's been said that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. But telling someone to turn the other cheek could be viewed as bad advice, because it could discourage people from actually standing up to defend themselves and to protect their rights and lives when necessary, when it's the right move. You would think that a wise being would have better counsel than this, better counsel than choosing between vengeance and essentially pacifism, that we could in fact work towards reasonable compromises that are just. Justice doesn't have to fall at the extremes. In verses 40 and 41, he says, if somebody sues you and takes your coat, let them have your cloak too. And if they want to compel you to go a mile, go 2. It's not bad to suggest that people go above and beyond, but there's no reason to set yourself up as an easily abused victim. A fair and cooperative society that doesn't encourage victimization is the sort of advice that we would expect from a wise being. In verse 42, he says, give to him that asketh of thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away. Now, everybody knows how bad this advice is. Encouraging charity is good, but no one takes this seriously. Any Christian willing to give me an interest-free loan, regardless of my financial situation and credit rating, please, just send me an email. In verses 43 through 48, we get to something else that might be considered very good advice. He says, you've heard it said, love thy neighbor, hate thy enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. This love thy enemies is good advice in the sense that it could be encouraging tolerance, compassion, cooperation, brotherhood. But it's not reasonable, and it's certainly not practiced. Most people don't love their enemies, including Christians, and apparently Jesus doesn't either, as he's planning on torturing his enemies forever or annihilating them, depending on the doctrine. We can encourage more compassion, but this passage doesn't really help, especially in light of other verses that encourage divisiveness, that encourage that they are separate from the world, that they're going to be persecuted by the world. It's overshadowed by the understanding that the speaker is planning on punishing his enemies forever. Moving on to chapter 6, beginning at verse 5, there's a discussion about prayer, some teachings about prayer, saying, don't pray standing on the corners of streets or standing in the synagogues, but go into your prayer closet and close the door. Don't use vain repetitions as heathen do. And don't be like them, because God already knows what you want before you ask him. This may be one of the best passages in the entire sermon, and yet very few Christians that I've met actually follow it. How much better would the world be if everyone's religious beliefs were a matter of private practice instead of constant attempts to push their beliefs onto everyone else? A proper adherence to this verse implies that prayer shouldn't be in school at all. It means that we shouldn't be swearing people in on Bibles, shouldn't open city council meetings with prayers, we shouldn't have a Christian television network, public prayer meetings, the National Day of Prayer, etc. Christians who support these goals are hypocrites. They're willfully disobeying a direct order that they believe is from Jesus. It's not like they're disobeying Paul or John. This is supposed to be the words of their Savior, and they chuck it aside, proving that they are their own God, making their own rules. And verse 7 says that you should pray what's in your heart and avoid rote recitation and chanting. And yet the passage continues with verses 9 through 13, which give the Lord's Prayer. And it's presented as pray after this manner. But what happens is it is prayed specifically, chanted and recited in nearly every Christian service on the planet. Catholics and Protestants alike have structured prayers and chanting, all in direct violation of what the previous passages said. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. This is quoted verbatim. It's drilled into the minds of people. They're not praying in the same manner. They're doing a rote recitation of this. Forgive men your trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Setting aside the promise of forgiveness from a God, that seems to be a good advice. Forgive people. If we include the promise of forgiveness from a God, we have a potential path to salvation that seems to be largely ignored by fundamentals. There are several occasions where Jesus discusses requirements for salvation, and all of them seem to focus on deeds and actions. He specifically asked, what must I do to get to heaven? And he says, keep the commandments. And yet, instead, most versions of salvation ignore that. And there's been a huge fight in Christian doctrine over the years, which we may take a look at a different time, about deeds and works and how important they are or aren't. Verses 16 through 18 cover instructions on fasting, and all I have to say is that fasting is silly and dangerous. It's a religious ritual that only exists, seemingly, because somebody discovered that if you torture your body by depriving it of food or sleep or other necessities, you'll eventually weaken the mind and it'll be susceptible to religious experiences, which really means hallucination and programming. It's a way of making people pliable, not to the will of God, but to the dictate of any authority figure. God shouldn't need people to torture themselves in order to communicate with them. It is absurd and unhealthy and therefore very bad advice. Like many other passages in the Bible, Matthew chapter 6 verses 25 through 34 may represent a deipity. A deipity is a term that was introduced to the world by philosopher Daniel Dennett, and it refers to a statement that seems to be profound, as if it's giving you a profound truth. But when investigated, to the extent that it is actually profound, it turns out to be false, and to the extent that it is true, it turns out to be trivial. This entire passage is, take no thought for your life, don't worry about tomorrow, God's going to provide, be like the birds of the air, they don't really, sow or reap, be like the lilies of the field, they don't worry about tomorrow, God's going to take care of everything. If viewed non-literally, if it was just advice of don't worry excessively, I could see this being pretty good advice, except that the reason it gives for not worrying isn't something that's really real. It's not something that we have good reason to believe, that God is going to take care of us, that we shouldn't worry about those things. But we all recognize that taken literally, this is horrible advice. Don't save money, don't get insurance, don't plan for retirement, don't participate and cooperate in making the world a better place. Just, run around preaching the word and God will provide, making you essentially a leech on society if it were taken literally. But everybody ignores it. Why? If this is something that Jesus actually spoke, then you would expect it to be important. And I don't see believers throughout my entire experience with the church and now actually taking this advice, certainly not literally, but even metaphorically. They still worry and they still take actions instead of just trusting. This seems to be more of when you absolutely can't do anything about something, go ahead and give that up and God will take care of that. Moving on to chapter 7 verses 1 through 5. Pretty good advice overall. Don't be a hypocrite. Don't be pointing out other people's flaws when you have the same flaws and haven't fixed your own. But verse 6 is a little weird. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye pearls before the swine, lest they trample them under feet and turn again and rend you. Now, there's a lot of different possible meanings, and the subject of this verse has been discussed a lot. I've heard sermons growing up that viewed it many different ways. Some consider it a cautionary warning to not waste your effort on the ungrateful, that we should strive to do good for those who need and appreciate it. And that's probably good advice, although you could probably make a case that some of the people who are ungrateful, if you were to do good things for them, you might be able to change their behavior. But I find it curious that someone who says, let your yes be yes, speak plainly and honestly, has to use such ambiguous language when he could have been more plain spoken about what he meant. And in verse 12, we find a version of the golden rule. Therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. The golden rule isn't original to Jesus. It's not even original to the Old Testament version that Jesus seems to be borrowing from. It's known as the ethic of reciprocity, and it's foundational to many secular concepts of moral and ethical action. Jesus' version, while fairly good, is actually one of the poorer versions I've seen. Saying do unto others what you would have them do to you isn't nearly as wise as do unto others as they would have you do unto them. I might like somebody to be brutally honest with me, but they might prefer that I sugarcoat my words. And it's better to treat them in the way that they want and encourage them to treat you in the way that you want. There are other things, other sayings that may be even better, like strive to do as much good as possible and as little harm as possible. Why didn't Jesus say something like that? As we near the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 20 talks about, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You'll know them by their fruits. A good tree can't bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits you shall know them. This is bad advice, and it's logically flawed. It's so flawed that no wise God could have ever said it or encouraged it. We're supposed to be on the lookout for false prophets. So how do we tell them apart? Well, take a look at their actions. False prophets, the bad trees, can't do good. Well, that's ridiculous to the point of being dangerous. In reality, any tree, any prophet could do good or bad. This applies globally. We know that there are people who may not be good, who can do good things. If we assume that they're true prophets, as long as they're producing good fruits, we're stuck accepting all of them until we actually catch them doing wrong. And so until such time as somebody exposes themselves as a false prophet, you would have to view them as a true prophet and follow them, even if they're not, even if you're unable to determine that what they're doing is bad. But he continues in verses 21 through 23, saying that not everybody who says, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father which is in heaven. And many will say to me that day, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? Have we not cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? And then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. This contradicts the previous passage by pointing out that you, in fact, cannot judge them by their fruit. Someone prophesied and drove out demons, which would be good fruit, which means they were doing God's work. But in fact, according to Jesus, they weren't, and he cast them aside. This raises additional questions about salvation, as apparently there are people who sincerely believe that they're doing the work of God, believe that they will be saved, do good works, and yet won't. This contradicts the notion that belief is a key element of salvation. And we conclude the Sermon on the Mount with Matthew 7, verses 24 through 29, the parable about building your house on rock and not on sand. And it's a fun little parable, but as we can see from the previous analysis, Jesus' words aren't any more stable than the sand. That crowd, the disciples, may have been amazed, but there's no reason any of us should be impressed. Sages who came before and after him have been both wiser and more foolish. There's nothing in this sermon that provides the great insight that we'd expect from a divine being, And the mistakes and poor advice seem to eliminate any claim that Jesus was anything more than a normal man, if indeed he existed. This sermon is a collection of some generic good advice, a couple of really nice ideas, and a bunch of horrible advice that demonstrates a level of ignorance that isn't the work of any divine being. Instead of providing brilliant instruction on how best to live life, it dismisses life in favor of promises of a life to come. Instead of providing advice on how to cooperate and live together, it establishes divisive doctrine. Instead of offering insight into the human condition and providing advice on how to have a healthy, thriving existence, it instead builds up an expectation of misery and persecution. It not only sets people up to accept their role as victim, it provides instruction on how best to take advantage of these willing victims. While believers may claim to consider it the greatest message ever delivered, we need only look at their actions to see that they're just as likely as the rest of us to dismiss the silly notions and bad advice in this sermon. And when I challenge this, one of the most common questions I get is, who are you to question God? So I think we'll answer that question in another episode.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.